Meteorologist Don Day joins me as we assess where we are at in our weather cycle and the outlook for 2023 across the country. Plus, we'll talk about what went wrong with the outlook for 2022 and what factors he attributes to missing the boat.
And that was wrong. That was wrong on many levels, including myself. We were looking at the data and we were relying fairly heavily on the modeling data, which was showing it weakening and going away.
Also, concerns on where the money is going when it comes to weather research and how climate policy is being shaped by misguided advocates and politicians.
In my business, you got to be more right than you're wrong. But unfortunately, politicians, people who are advocates for things, for some reason they're given a pass on being spectacularly wrong.
Weather outlook for 2023 and more on this episode of the Working Ranch Radio Show. And we welcome you here to the Working Ranch Radio Show. I'm Justin Mills. Thanks for joining us on our program here today. This is episode 102, and we're glad to have you joining us. And I mentioned that mainly, I know there's several of you listening on the radio. We appreciate that. I know some have also already downloaded it through the podcast provider. But if you want to go back and listen to it, a good way to do that is just search workingranchradio.com is our website to get to our podcast site where you can find that. But also, if you listen to any streaming service out there that's also supplies podcasts, we're on that as well. So I just thought I'd pass that along for you. Now, for today's show, as I said in the opening, meteorologist Don Day will be joining us for our entire show. And I'd like to bring him in from time to time as we get a look at our long-term weather. And this show is no different than that. But I thought the timing of it would be very applicable, mainly because there has been a lot of talk the last couple of years, as we know, about La Nina, and it does look as though it is fading. But then on the horizon, we're looking at El Nino, and when will that take place? Well, we're going to talk about that. Don will give us his take on that, in addition to the timing of when all that happens and how that could affect some different portions of the country. And so I think that will be very relevant to us here in agriculture from a more outlook or immediate standpoint. Now, we're also going to be talking about some other elements when it comes to weather. And one of the things I always like to talk to him about are just some of the other things like when we see some extreme weather events and how climate change then begins to become part of the conversation. So we're going to talk with him about that. Also, some of his concerns on where the money is going when it comes to weather research, and in addition to where climate policy is being shaped and some different elements of that. So I think you'll enjoy today's program. Again, meteorologist Don Day joining us for our entire show. And then, of course, we'll also have him in his regular segment as well as we get a more immediate look at about that 7, 10 to 14-day forecast for folks here across the country. Of course, as we regularly do in our show, the Captain Tim O'Byrne, publisher and editor of Working Ranch Magazine, will be in for this week's edition of Tim's 2 Cents. So stick around for that. He'll be by in just a few moments. Looking at our bull sale calendar, Stockman Source 10th Annual Open House Bull Sale coming up February 4th. Now, I didn't know if you had an opportunity to listen to last week's show. It was an update on the waters of the U.S. Rules change that have come down from the Biden administration. Also, we had a good conversation with both Jeremy Martin and Travis Chrisman with Stockman Source Bull Sale. That sale February 4th there at the ranch of Jeremy and Gail Martins. That's 35 miles southwest of North Platte. But it's also going to be on DV Auction at 3 p.m. Central. 100 head of coming 2-year-old Sim-Angus bulls. Also 35 head of coming 2 Angus bulls as well. Ranch raised. These are balanced bulls bred for low input but yield performance on the rail. If you want to find out more, go to their website. Also, there is a catalog there now as well. ssbeefbulls.com. That is the website for Stockman Source 10th Annual Open House Bull Sale coming up on February 4th. Well, last week when I checked in with the captain, he was just finishing up the March issue of Working Ranch Magazine, and I know you already have your current issue on hand, but be looking forward to that one. By the way, if you do not have your subscription to Working Ranch Magazine, you can simply go to the website at workingranchmag.com and you can get your subscription started today. But now, though, let's check in with the captain, Tim O'Byrne. He is publisher and editor of Working Ranch Magazine for this week's edition of Tim's 2 Cents.
Hey, Justin. Hey, everybody out there in Working Ranch Radio Land. Here's a headline. USDA seeks public comment on proposal to strengthen animal disease traceability regulations. What are they considering here? The USDA Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, APHIS, is proposing to amend animal disease traceability regulations and require electronic identification for interstate movement of certain cattle and bison. APHIS is also proposing to revise and clarify record requirements. These changes would strengthen the nation's ability to quickly respond to significant animal disease outbreaks. Justin, what do you think about this? Folks, get back to Justin on this. And I want to hear from our Canadian counterparts because they've had a national traceback system for, maybe 20 years. And it wasn't always easy to make that happen. So if any of you Canadians have a story for us, you want to relate, maybe we can learn from it. It sounds like this thing is coming. This is a public comment that they're asking for. So check with your state cattlemen's association and let's stick with this, guys. Justin, back to you.
All right, thanks, Captain. You bet. Let us know what you think. If you want to reach out to me, my email address is justin.workingranch@gmail.com. And like the captain said, a lot of the state associations and even the national associations have information out there about what will be affected, what won't be affected by some of these changes. I encourage you to go and look those up for yourself, read those out. Now, I wasn't overly concerned with some of the stuff that I saw in that, but again, here's the thing. The devil's going to be in the details, or the devil's going to be in the interpretations by the bureaucrats on how this comes down. So it's definitely something you want to be aware of when you look at that. Interestingly enough, when we talk about some of this kind of stuff, RFID tags, of course, are an element to this that has been in conversation. And along those same lines, the other day I was having a conversation with my neighbor about banks tagging some heifers, and I was saying that I'm moving to using the RFID tags in the ears rather than the little metal clips, and I could sense some hesitation on his part, and I know a lot of it had to do with that and the RFID element that comes with that. But for me, I guess I was looking at it purely from a perspective of efficiency when we're working cattle. I run a lot of cattle for different folks, and sometimes they lose the number tags that are in their ear. And brands, you can look at the brand and know who owns it, but yet you don't know what cow that was. And so I've looked at RFID tags as a means of just being a little bit more efficient and effective of what we do here on our operation, but that may not be the case for everybody, and I know there's some valid concerns by folks. But back to what we were originally talking about, the USDA with these this public comment period that's out there on animal disease traceability regulations. Be sure to read that through and take a look for yourself with that. And if you do have concerns, please be sure to reach out to your state and your national associations that are representing you, and also your representatives and senators as well, because they're the ones that are going to be looking at this as well and can help us out if we have some concerns on that. Well, as we head to break here now, I thought it was interesting. Some folks had posted some pictures the other day on Facebook of new calves showing up. Now, I know not everybody's calving, and if you're not, well, then your old mother cows, they're kind of in that time frame that's pretty important. That third trimester period for cows, pregnant cows, is pretty important, because if you want a good, healthy calf, well, it's going to have to start with a good, healthy mother in order to get the essential vitamins and minerals and nutrients into that calf, so that when that calf hits the ground, it's up and going and stays going throughout the spring and into the summer as well. And the folks at New Generation Supplements, here's the deal. They have a tub for that, but I don't say that kind of flippantly as if they have one tub, because here is the deal. They know that there are a lot of different types of cow herds out there that need different things in different parts of the country, which is why at New Generation Supplements, they have over 100 formulas that will fit the different needs that are out there. And if you want to find out more, you can go to their website at newgenerationsupplements.com. If you don't recognize that name, you might recognize these names. How about Smart Lick or Feed in a Drum and Megalick? Yeah, that's the brand of products that you'll find out there. Go to their website at newgenerationsupplements.com if you want to find out more. New Generation Feeds, they have a tub for that. Well, stay with us. When we come back, we're going to get into our featured topic as meteorologist Don Day joins us as we take a look at our weather outlook for 2023 when we return on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Set up the next generation for a productive lifetime with Zinpro Avela 4. Achieve productive success in your cows with 20% increased conception rate and a 16-day tighter calving interval. Calves from cows supplemented with Zinpro hit the ground running with improved immunity and 28 more pounds at weaning. Allow your cows and calves to perform to their full potential with Zinpro Avela 4.
And we welcome you back here to the Working Ranch Radio Show. I'm Justin Mills as we head now into our featured interview here today. And joining us for this show this week is no stranger, of course, as meteorologist Don Day regularly joins us to give us weather outlook for the coming week or two out as we look across the country. Today, though, a little bit longer. And Don, first of all, thanks for joining us here. There's a lot of things that we want to get into here today, but specifically kind of looking ahead for spring, into the winter, spring, and into summer, fall, as much as we can with the information in front of us. And so I know one of the things, let's real quick kind of look back a bit. We know that we're coming a bit out of a La Nina, and you had talked about we're going to be hitting that neutral phase and then looking in at potentially at some point down the road getting into El Nino. So where are we at with that from looking at the Pacific temperatures and the waters, and where are we at from that cycle in our weather system?
Well, we are in the third year of a La Nina, and these multi-year La Ninas, I can't stress enough how impactful they are. When you put more than 2 years of a La Nina together, it is a real problem maker. It's a drought maker. It causes more extreme weather and a lot of craziness to go on. And right now we're seeing it beginning to weaken. Now, I will tell you, a year ago at this time, it was weakening. Mm-hmm. And one thing that happened last season as we went through the winter and then into spring of 2022 was we were somewhat optimistic that we were in a weakening phase. And then all of a sudden we got into June, July, and August, and La Nina roared back and said, I'm not done yet. I've got one more year. And what's interesting is if you go back historically and look at these Pacific cold and warm cycles, La Nina being a cold one in the tropical Pacific, we've only seen these multi-year La Ninas, multi-year meaning going more than 2 years. We've actually seen 3 of these in the last 30 years. Okay. But then you got to go back to the 1950s before that happened before. So we went from the mid to late 50s all the way up to the middle 90s before with only one of these events. But in the last 30 years, we've had 3 multi-year La Ninas. And that's important to point out because since we're learning more and more about La Ninas and their propensity to cause drought in the west and central areas of the United States, we've had 3 of these episodes. So that's really important. And trying to understand why we've had 3 in the last 30 years is something that needs a lot more study. Now, you might say, well, that's because of global warming and because the Earth is warmer. It's like, well, La Nina is when the sea surface temperatures out in the Pacific near the equator are colder, not warmer. So you can't answer that question of why we've had 3 of these in the last 30 years from using that approach.
Yeah. Well, and as you started answering the question, I was writing down another thought I wanted you to talk about, and that was anytime we see extreme weather, and it's almost like clockwork. You could almost just, the next day or the next weeks on the news cycle out there, you're going to see, well, all of the proponents of climate change coming out and say, well, this is why we're seeing extensive raining in California, and this is why we're seeing these different issues. And the climate change conversation always comes up when we have extreme weather.
Which is interesting because the proponents of that say we shouldn't take a single weather event and claim that counteracts whatever the argument is. So they'll say an Arctic outbreak or it being really cold for a month isn't a sign because, well, that's just the weather and that's just not climate. I call them climate ambulance chasers. Basically, if you have a hurricane, a flood, a tornado, a blizzard, or whatever, they're there the next day making a claim that, well, see what happened. But there's a lot of problems with that. In anybody that has any inkling of knowledge of weather and climate knows that we've had extreme weather since day one, and we will continue to have extreme weather. And what causes extreme weather is the weather. And we're just going to go through these, and we go through these cycles. But I want to get back to your La Nina question because I don't think I answered it, Justin. Because you were kind of saying, like, where are we at? And I mentioned a year ago we were hopeful that maybe the summer of 2022 it would fade, and it didn't. Came back, and that was wrong. That was wrong on many levels. Including myself. We were looking at the data, and we were relying fairly heavily on the modeling data, which was showing it weakening and going away. But one difference in the sense that we see going into this spring and summer season is, why are we more confident than we were a year ago? Well, number one is having a 4 or 5 year La Nina we haven't seen before. Number two, we're seeing, from an historical standpoint, we don't have any precedent. And number two, is that the depth of the water, it's not only the surface of the water, but how deep is that cold water from the surface going down several meters. And we're seeing it really eroding and getting thinner and thinner. And we're also seeing some other things out in the Pacific that is indicating that it's in its death throes. So we're pretty optimistic that indeed La Nina will go to a neutral phase, which we call La Nada, probably by March or April. And if we do go into an El Nino, technically speaking, if it's an official El Nino, which means those subtropical waters are a 0.5 degree centigrade above the 30-year average, well, then we can start talking about we're in an El Nino. But it may not be officially an El Nino until late summer or fall.
Mm-hmm. And I want to talk a little bit more about that in a bit. I want to go back when you talked about the fact that last summer everybody kind of got it wrong with the fact that we did never really break out of that La Nina. As you look back in it, hindsight being 2020, were there some indicators we missed? What would you, if you had to go back and say, this is what I learned from last year, what would that be?
Well, there's two things, and both of these things could have been factors. And I think one thing that we need to go back and look at is, I've mentioned that we've had this 3 times in the last 30 years, which means we've had it 3 times over the last 3 solar cycles. And what we do tend to see is a correlation between these really strong La Ninas happen after solar minimums. And one thing that the solar minimums that we've had over the last 3 decades have been very intense solar minimums, meaning long periods without sunspot activity, and the solar influence may be something that is not inputted or well enough understood to be inputted into the modeling to take into account the strength of these La Ninas, because we do tend to see the most intense La Ninas right after a solar minimum. And that's when this last one got started in 2020. The other thing, and this is, again, something that needs more study. So what I'm going to tell you here, nobody's backed this up yet with any solid data yet, other than some cursory examinations of looking at the data. But that Tonga volcano that went off in the just east of New Zealand in January of last year, from all the data that we've been able to look at, it's the biggest amount of water vapor that's ever been put into the stratosphere that's been observed, at least been observed by satellites and by being able to be measured. We don't have a huge database going back to other volcanic eruptions because we didn't have the satellites in place. But there is the possibility that the amount of water vapor and sulfur dioxide and other things that get thrown into the lower stratosphere from these volcanic eruptions may have played a role in kind of altering what was going on in that subtropical Pacific. Possibly. We don't know that for sure. But somebody will say, well, thanks for your long range forecast, but what could go wrong? And it's like, well, Well, one wild card is volcanic eruptions, and one wild card that can loom large is if it's a big one. And if it's especially at a lower latitude, it could have an impact. So those are the two things. One is I don't think we really have a good grasp on what the solar impacts could be in these specific oscillations, and also possibly that Tonga volcano. Or number three, we need to go back and work on our modeling and find out exactly what went wrong and what inputs and what variables did we not input correctly.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah. I've actually heard and read some things about that volcano as maybe having some impact that we didn't yet really realize at the time. So interesting to hear your perspective on that as well. Well, folks, stay with us. My guest today is meteorologist Don Day, as we are talking weather through our entire show. He's joining us for that. When we come back, we're going to continue with him. Stay tuned. You're listening to the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Don't keep your cow-calf herd data in a notebook. Keep it in the cloud with Performance Ranch and say so long to decoding handwritten notes. Performance Ranch is an easy-to-use app that simplifies record-keeping and makes decision-making easier. Keep track of herd inventory, monitor health records, and manage costs, all from your iPad or iPhone. Group texting important herd data? Delete it. Use Performance Ranch instead. Go to performancelivestockanalytics.com and be the first to know when Performance Ranch is ready to launch.
And welcome back to the Working Ranch Radio Show. I'm Justin Mills. My guest today is meteorologist Don Day, as we're taking a little bit of an extended look into our weather, not only forecast, but also just some of the information. We talked a little bit in the last segment about the timing of El Nino, and we're going to talk a little bit about that more here again. But we also talked about what went wrong last year in terms of the forecast that looked like we were going to break out of La Nina, and that didn't really happen. So we're going to continue on now. And Don, one of the things you had mentioned, and I guess I feel right now with our data that we have for us that we're really making some big strides in having weather data that is providing a lot of useful information. I mean, not to say that for 20, 30 years ago that weather forecasters and meteorologists wasn't helpful, but there's some really big strides happening, I feel. And as we continue to go in the next 20, 30, 40, 60 years or 100 years down, it's really going to get better. And so that's what I see. You talked a little bit ago about the modeling, and maybe we need to go back and reevaluate modeling. How has the modeling changed, and where do you see it going as we move forward?
Well, models need to be viewed as like a screwdriver or a hammer or a wrench in your toolbox, which means is that what the model tries to do with these models, we talk about all these weather models all the time, is they try to represent the atmosphere, what the atmosphere will do over time after the atmosphere is measured. And measured, I mean weather balloons and satellites. We get a sampling of what the atmosphere is doing around the entire world. And then we plug all that temperature, humidity, and pressure information into a very sophisticated computer program and say, all right, what's happening now? What's going to happen in the next 10 minutes? What's going to happen in the 10 minutes after that? Then what's going to happen in the next 20 minutes after that? And then we try to project it forward. And that's where you get all of the forecasts that you see on your smartphone or on your computer, or what you see at night on TV is that you get what the model thinks the atmosphere will do over time. And the models certainly have gone through some big improvements. And, computer modeling with weather got started in the 50s and 60s. But as processors got faster, it was really not until the 1980s and 90s before it got a lot more in depth. And there was a large body of people in academia and government that really thought in the early 90s that by the year 2020, and we're just past where there is now, that the art of weather modeling would be to the point where it would be very accurate. It would be able to tell you with a good amount of certainty what was going to happen over the next 10 days. Well, we've got it to about 5 days. Your accuracy is going to be pretty good with temperature and precipitation. Won't be perfect, but it'll be okay. But for the last 20 years, penetrating that 5 days and trying to get it more accurate, we've kind of hit a wall, even with the computers getting faster, which means is we don't understand everything once we get out past that 124-hour time frame, there's some things going on with the weather and variables that we think we understand that maybe we don't. Or you know what? There's another good possibility. There are some variables that affect our weather that we don't even know about. And until we do more research and we understand, you always hear the term, well, garbage in, garbage out. So if you have inputs and variables into that model that's not up to snuff, or there's something wrong with it, well, you end up with garbage eventually. We went through a period of time, and we're still kind of in this now for the last, I would say, 20, 30 years of weather forecasting, where the models became so good in that 5-day period, and they decided to make them go out further, 10 to 15 days, that they're got to be an over-reliance on the modeling. And I think it's a natural progression of kind of the science, and it's a natural progression, I think, of anything, which is you get a new tool, you get new technology, and then you basically sell your soul to it, because it can really be your friend on some days and your enemy the next. But the ability right now for somebody at home to get on a computer and see these computer models is easy. It's free. You can see that. It's very enticing. But what I think what's good now is that we're starting to realize, and I think more and more meteorologists are realizing this, that the model isn't reality. The model is a tool. And if you really want to make a good forecast and you really want to hone your skills, especially when folks need a 10, a 20, a 30, a 60-day forecast, is you don't rely so much on the modeling, but you go back to kind of the basics, which is understanding the oceans, understanding the sun, trying to understand things that we're not putting in the models. And I think that's where the key lies into better weather forecasting, is what's not in the models, because what's not in the models could be very well why forecasts go wrong.
As you were talking about that, I was thinking, so yeah, we have these models and they're fairly decent 3-5 days out. And as you were talking about, we need to go back to some of the basics, and that's getting back to where I guess I felt you've been able to always interject a lot of common sense in this, in the fact that we're looking at cycles, we're looking at the knowns that we have now, and you say looking at some of those factors, that's what's going to be critical as we start to make these long-term forecasts. And so from your standpoint, do we have some good sources? I mean, I know you're providing that, but where else are we finding, some of that good forecasting or meteorology that should be taking place that helps us in agriculture?
Well, there lies in part of the problem, and this is where it kind of gets to be a socio-economic and a political discussion, because it's where are you putting your resources in research? And you're not going to get a meteorologist or an atmospheric scientist who's going to make a breakthrough in weather forecasting, let's say 15, 20, or 30 days in advance, if you're not funding it. There is a tremendous amount of money going into what's going to happen in the next 50, 100, 200 years. And simply put, that's where the money is.
Yeah.
So if you're a researcher, instead of, let's say, how are we going to make a better 15-day forecast for agriculture? There's no money there. I may be mistaken, but I'm pretty sure I'm right.
Yeah.
But the money's there if you want to study nitrous oxide and its impact on the climate in the next 1,000 years. So it's kind of where are we putting our resources? And in the field of meteorology and climate, the resources right now are going to things that are not, in my opinion, helping forecasters. And but then you're getting political, and then you're getting into, these things to where, if you want to affect and change that, you have to talk to the policymakers, and you have to tell them what is most important for you as a producer. Is it more important for you as a producer to know what's going to happen in the year 2100 or next February?
Well, and what I find interesting is that has there been any of this long-term forecasting that's being funded that has actually come true in the time frame that they expected, because we can all, in fact, just here recently, we've had, political folks on there saying, climate change this, climate change that's with our weather. And some of them were real big advocates that by 20, we've already passed some of these dates, that we would be underwater. So my question is all this money is going towards some of this long-term stuff, but has any of it, do you know of anything that's actually hit the target?
Well, in terms of, big predictions like certain parts of the world being underwater, like the Maldives or Manhattan, or the fact that I believe in 2009, someone said there wasn't going to snow again. So there's been some spectacular failures for sure. Now, I will tell you that some of that research should help in terms of trying to make better weather forecasting, at least from a seasonal standpoint. But when you fixate yourself on the inputs being greenhouse gases, when we know very well that there's more to the story of weather than greenhouse gases, well, if you fixate on that, you're going to miss these ocean patterns. You're going to miss what changes the water temperature in the Pacific and the Atlantic. Why do these water temperatures change? And that then affects our weather. Until we start asking those questions and putting some resources into it, we're not going to see big improvements in that 15, that 30, that 60 or 90-day outlook.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Well, it's interesting because there's been some here recently. In fact, former Vice President Al Gore just recently making news and being very big proponent of things changing. And it's interesting because many of the claims that he had has not really happened up to this date. And so you just wonder, that's where all the attention and money's going. And has anything actually hit the mark? So.
No, not at all. And that's the thing is, in my business, if I'm wrong, I hear about it right away. and the thing is that in my business, you got to be more right than you're wrong. But unfortunately, politicians, people who are advocates for things, for some reason, they're given a pass on being spectacularly wrong. And I guess it's because it's viewed that the intentions are good. The intentions are good, therefore you give them a little slack if they're really far off and really long. But the problem I have, and I think, and this is something in the last couple of years, when people ask me questions about this, it's like what you got to understand is that people who have been really wrong are the ones who are making policy decisions. And so are those policy decisions really based on good information? And if you're going to have a catastrophic outlook on everything and then base your policy on that, well, who ends up being affected by that the most? Well, basically the people, the little people, so to speak. Mm-hmm. The burdens that are going to be put on agriculture. Just look at what they're doing in Europe right now with nitrous oxide, carbon dioxide emissions, all of those things. The people making those policy decisions are some of the people who have been wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, we're going to come back with more with meteorologist Don Day. Don, you talked about it a little bit in the first segment about the timing of when we might think El Nino should come back. I want to get a little bit more into that as we just sort of go through the country and get a little bit of a maybe 3 to 6 month outlook or what we think could be happening there when we come back in our next segment, folks. Just stay with us. You're listening to the Working Ranch Radio Show. Cattle producers, here's a way to put more dollars in your pocket. Put the Amafirm advantage found in all Gain Smart mineral to work in your cow herd. Amafirm is the industry leader in increasing fiber digestion. In fact, research shows putting Amafirm to work increases forage utilization by 10%, reducing overall forage costs and allowing you to graze more animals per acre. That's a big-time return on your investment. To find which Gain Smart mineral formula is right for your herd, visit gainsmart.com. And we welcome you back here to the Working Ranch Radio Show. I'm Justin Mills. My guest today, meteorologist Don Day, as we take an extended look at our weather out there. We've had some great discussion, not only about the last year or so and some of the weather we saw, but also just some other concepts in there in terms of cycles and various things like that. Don, a bit ago in the first segment, I believe you talked a little bit about as we've come out of La Nina or where we're at now currently, but let's look ahead maybe the next 3 3 to 6 months, maybe a little bit further out. I know we can't nail anything down specifically, but from the data that you're seeing, and as you and I were talking off air a little bit, I mean, what we do know is, the cycles of the Pacific and the cycles in the Atlantic, and we know those kinds of things. So based upon the knowns that we have before us, what are you seeing as when El Nino would be occurring, and what's, I guess, the probability of how that's going to play out?
Well, one really encouraging aspect on things maybe changing in terms of this 3-year period that's brought so much drought is that what we've seen over the last month in California, with that onslaught of big, heavy rains and big snows in the mountains of the West, that's another indication of things changing out in the Pacific. And we have seen that California moisture get pushed pretty far out into the plains in the usually one of the drier times of the year. So that's one encouraging thing that we look at as we peer into spring and go into summer. The last 4 to 5 weeks has been encouraging. Encouraging in the sense that, well, maybe we're kind of going into this next cycle phase to where we don't have a period of time where we put La Niñas back to back. La Niña will come back. It certainly will. But what you want to see, and you want to see that warm phase of that neutral La Nada situation go to an El Nino for a couple of years. Then you probably will have a La Nina in between that, and then you'll probably have another El Nino cycle. That's what we kind of see over the next 5 or 6 years, which is a trend that is going to be more wet for the central and western United States. And when you see this pattern historically, when you see the multi-year La Niñas end, you do have a spike in precipitation for the central and western areas of the United States. Mm-hmm. So I am optimistic that the Pacific Northwest, the Rockies, what we've seen in California, the desert states, and then going into the parts of the plains. So we've got some areas of Nebraska and Kansas, southeastern Colorado, the panhandles of Oklahoma and Texas that are still really, really dry, and that goes up into parts of the Northwest Corn Belt as well. I think those areas are going to see things turn around and be much better than the last 2 or 3 years. So for the central and western United States, I think producers are going to enter a 3-year period here of better precipitation, less in the way of extremes once we can say goodbye to this La Nina, because a La Nina is much more impactful than an El Nino is, especially when there's more of them when they're back to back. Question marks as we get into the Corn Belt and parts of the eastern United States are certainly there. Mm-hmm. Because the further you get from the Pacific, obviously it kind of makes sense that the effects of the Pacific kind of fade out a little bit. And then you kind of take a real close look at what the Gulf of Alaska is doing, and then the Atlantic for the central and eastern Corn Belt, and then for areas into the east and southeastern United States. Now, there have been tendencies when you do go from a La Nina to an El Nino for parts of the southeastern United States, and this would maybe affect parts of the eastern Corn Belt to be drier than normal. So one thing you do see in a La Nina is you do tend to see the southeast as being more wet. Mm-hmm. And you go to an El Nino, they tend to go drier. So it's kind of like pick your poison. Yeah. Some areas are going to see improvements, and this will be most notable in the West, while some areas of the east, central, and southeastern United States, well, they may start to see a little bit of a drier trend. Also, if you go into an El Nino by next late summer or fall, El Ninos are not very favorable for a lot of hurricane activity. You still get hurricanes, but you don't tend to see as many during an El Nino cycle. Yeah.
Well, and as you were talking about that and breaking down the different areas that could be wetter, could be drier based upon this change that's happening, and you and I have both read the similar information on there about the concern of and timing of when El Nino would happen, and the timing in such a case that it could bring that dryness or drought. And they're just saying drought in general, but as you were saying, it could be more specifically the eastern side of that Corn Belt. So the timing of El Nino, that's going to be somewhat key to this. Is that, I guess that's what I gathered from it.
Yeah, no, timing is really everything, because what you tend to see El Nino do is you tend to see El Nino bring heavier precipitation during late winter, spring into early summer. When you get into a fall pattern, early winter weather pattern, the impacts sometimes aren't as big. So if the El Nino's late to start and its impacts of adding more water vapor to the air and making it easier to rain in many areas, if it doesn't get going full-fledged till July or August or even September, well, then you've kind of missed that window for it to be able to help this next growing season. And I think the biggest concerns with that do rely in the Midwest. And I think that is an area where there are more question marks. If you would look at the most recent drought monitor conditions, improvements in California and some of the Rockies have been so extensive that the bullseye of the drought right now is in the winter wheat country of Kansas, Oklahoma, southeastern Colorado, and to across Nebraska and into northwest Iowa. Those are the areas that I think this spring will benefit the most from La Nina weakening. I think the El Nino situation is going to be more impactful in terms of when it starts more towards the east.
Mm-hmm. So I want to talk about this as a little bit of a change in direction, but it when we look at the snowpack that we've seen, you've talked about great improvements on the West Coast coming off the Pacific, the moisture coming off the Pacific West Coast, and it's stretched out into the northern plains and some of the plain states. So the question is this: are we shaping up to see some flooding this spring? Because that's the next thing. I know Canada's had quite a bit of moisture in certain areas up there. And, I'm thinking of, Red River several years ago that flooded out of North Dakota and down. I mean, we've got, of course, the Missouri and the Missouri River in there. You and I before talking about the Platte River in Wyoming. So are we shaping up to maybe see some pretty significant flooding this spring?
Well, I certainly think there's going to be that concern as we go into the areas where the snowpacks have been really big. And I do think this will be more of a Western situation. And I do think like the North Platte, the South Platte, some of those river drainages there, going back to that Red River Valley, flooding we had, that was in 2019. Mm-hmm. Now that wasn't really that long ago. And, there was too much rain in Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota, and parts of Iowa and everywhere else. And that 2019 was our last really strong El Nino. So I think if we're going to have flooding concerns, it's going to be in the Mountain West this spring. Not to say that downstream into parts of maybe Nebraska and those areas that some of those rivers are going to go up, but by then you've got several dams helping out. Red River Valley area, I don't see that as a big concern, at least this spring, maybe spring of 24.
Okay. Yeah. Well, it's just interesting because the snowpack is significantly different this year than it has been the last few years. So, Don, I want you to stay with us if you can for one more segment. That'll be our regular kind of long-term weather outlook if we can. I sure appreciate you joining us here today. So stick around, folks. When we come back, meteorologist Don Day staying with us as we take a look at the next 10 to 14 days out for our weather across the country. We'll be back on the Working Ranch Radio Show after this. Starting off in the right direction is essential to gaining an advantage later when you go to market your calves. And I have proof that the right direction is with Sim Angus sired calves. A 2020 study by K-State showed that Sim Angus sired steer calves earn more at sale time than all other breed identified sire groups with at least 50 lots represented on Superior Livestock's 2020 summer sales. The proof's right there. For low-risk, high-potential calves with earning potential, be confident that Sim Genetics will give you more per head, period. Stand strong, Simmental. And we welcome you back here to the Working Ranch Radio Show. I'm Justin Mills. This is our regular segment where meteorologist Don Day joins us as we take a look at our long-term weather. And if you've been joining us through the program, you know that he has been with us as we've been talking a bit of a weather outlook across the country here for the next several months and just some good other weather information and dialogue as well. Don, as we look at the next 7, 10, 14 days out there, I know for us where I'm at here in northeastern Wyoming, we've seen a little bit of a weather change. It had been pretty mild since the big cold that we had the end of December, but we had already talked about that we were going to start to see some weather changing. It started to happen, and how does that look for the next 10 to 14 days out?
Well, I think folks need to be ready for certainly a colder weather pattern for most of the lower 48 states as we go into the last week of January and as we go into early February. There's some large-scale things going on. One thing is what we call a stratospheric warming event, where the high stratosphere over the polar regions warms up and expands and literally just pushes a lot of the colder air that's in the higher latitudes more south. And that's responsible for some of our bigger Arctic outbreaks. Now, we did not have this when we had that big Arctic outbreak in December that was so intense. But if you go back and look at the last two Februaries, 2020 was that big Arctic outbreak that hit Texas and caused so many problems. We also had a big Arctic outbreak that wasn't as intense, but pretty impressive in 2021 in February. I think we're going to see that again. Odds are pretty good that for most of the nation from the Rockies east, especially in the middle part of the country, I think the Intermountain West, the Dakotas, the Western High Plains, the central states are going to see a colder than average period from the last week of January. And I think we're probably going to go into early March with this. So I do think the real cold won't get into the southeast or the East Coast, at least not hold there. I think the colder weather will be bottled up right in the nation's midsection. So the stretch of weather when California was getting all those storms, Pacific air flooded a lot of the nation from just after Christmas till just here recently. And that really skewed temperatures. And I think a lot of folks forgot about how cold it was in December. And they were thinking, I did see several tweets, oh, winter's over, winter's over. I'm like, oh, my goodness. No, it's kind of like intermission. So do be ready for some colder weather. And I do think for livestock interests in parts of the Northern Plains and parts of the Rockies, there's going to be some rough stretches of colder than average conditions. And we've got some places, there's a lot of snow on the ground in some areas. So, that is going to be impactful as we go into. So there's plenty of winter left. And I think we're certainly going to see that late January through the month of February.
When you talk about this change that's happening, it's going to be a little bit colder than average or than what we've seen. Much moisture with it. I know some of the moisture that's come with the snow has been pretty good here lately. But as we see these colder temperatures, will there be a lot of snow with what we're seeing across the country?
Usually in February, you don't tend to get the really big snows that you get towards that March and April timeframe, at least when you get away from the oceans. The eastern seaboard's kind of a different story. However, you'll have more frequent snow events. So while you may not have, one big system, you have several small to moderate sized systems when you get into this colder pattern. So there will be some snow coming your way. And you just kind of look at what's happened here recently, the amount of snow and moisture that fell across parts of Wyoming, Colorado, and especially Nebraska and the northwest Iowa, this most recent storm. There were some areas that got over 2 inches of water. That doesn't happen very often in January. So the January is already off to a good start in some of those areas. But I know there's some areas that have barely gotten anything in this pattern, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, northern Minnesota, southern Canada. While California was getting all these big storms, they were watching all that moisture stay to the west and south. But those areas I just mentioned, they're going to get back into the act. Don't worry, we haven't forgotten about you. We're going to come back and make it snow and get colder in those areas too.
Before we get too far here, I know I always bring up the fog forecast deal. I just mentioned it to you off air just a little bit ago, and I'm showing April to be pretty wet for us here in this part of the country.
Yeah, and again, going back and historically looking at when we've seen similar patterns with a fading La Nina, we do tend to have colder and wetter springs. And if you're going to have a colder and wetter spring, you're going to have events that you're seeing now in April. Well, I think you may be onto something.
Well, we need grass to grow too. So it's we just figure out a way to manage through it. So, Don, I sure appreciate you joining us here for our show here today. A lot of insight. I sure appreciate your take because, as I said before, and there's a lot of common sense to some of this, and I and I've always liked the fact that while you are looking ahead and you're providing forecast information, you're really going back and looking at some of that data to provide good sound information. So I always appreciate your take on it, and appreciate you being a part of Working Ranch Radio Show.
I enjoyed it.
And again, that was meteorologist Don Day joining us here today for our entire show. His website, dayweather.com. And I just can't express again how appreciative I am for him being a part of Working Ranch Radio Show. You know, I've told folks this story. Years ago, I was in ag media in Billings, Montana, and it was interesting because one of my jobs at that time was talking agriculture news and the markets. And we always thought we had a pretty valuable job. But the person that people wanted to hear most, though, was the guy that was talking on ag weather. And so I find that no matter what we have going on here in agriculture on issues and various topics that we bring to light here on the Working Ranch Radio Show, weather is also something that here in agriculture we deal with on a daily basis. And so I like to have that as a part of our show, and appreciates Don's perspective on that, and appreciate him being a part of what we have going on here. Again, his website, as he does kick out a daily video podcast, and I know sometimes it might be a little specific to some areas of the region, but nevertheless it is talking nationally, and I encourage you to go and listen to his daily video podcast. You can find it by going to his website at dayweather.com, or you can also go to YouTube and search Day Weather as well and find it there. Well, stay with us. When we come back, we're going to put a wrap on this week's show, and I'll give you an idea of what we're going to be working on future shows here of the Working Ranch Radio Show. We'll be back after this.
Do you have a young child, grandchild, niece, or nephew that loves the weather and wants to learn more? Day Weather has produced a children's weather journal full of weather facts, fun weather experiments, coloring pages, and pages to record weather observations for every season of the year. The weather journal is for ages 3 to 7 and designed to be fun and educational. The interactive weather projects are fun for the whole family to take part in. For only $10, the Day Weather Journal is a great gift idea for any occasion. Click on our Amazon link to order at dayweather.com.
Don't keep your cow-calf herd data in a notebook. Keep it in the cloud with Performance Ranch and say so long to decoding handwritten notes. Performance Ranch is an easy-to-use app that simplifies record-keeping and makes decision-making easier. Keep track of herd inventory, monitor health records, and manage costs, all from your iPad or iPhone. Group texting important herd data? Delete it. Use Performance Ranch instead. Go to performancelivestockanalytics.com and be the first to know when Performance Ranch is ready to launch.
Well, before we talk about what's going to be on tap for upcoming shows here on the Working Ranch Radio Show, I did want to let you know that here in a couple of weeks, going to be headed south down to New Orleans, Louisiana. Myself, and I know a lot of folks from all across the country, will be headed down for the 2023 Cattle Industry Convention and NCBA Trade Show. That's going to be Wednesday, February 1st through Friday, February 3rd. Just quickly looking at some of the things on the schedule in that opening general session. Taylor Sheridan, he's the writer of the hit series Yellowstone, 1883, 1923. He will be the speaker in that opening general session. Of course, the one I'm looking forward to will be to hear from Cattle Facts of what they perceive to be for the 2023 outlook and following years as well. So just a couple of the many things that will be taking place down at the 2023 Cattle Industry Convention. Be sure to stop through the trade show. Say hello. I will be at the Working Ranch magazine booth. That's where you'll find me. Stop in, say hi. And also, you can grab the latest issue of Working Ranch magazine while you're there as well. But if you want to find out more about the 2023 Cattle Industry Convention, go to the website at convention.ncba.org. Again, that is going to be in New Orleans, February 1st through the 3rd. Hope to see you there. Now, here are some of the topics that we are working on for upcoming shows on the Working Ranch Radio Show, and that is raising kids on the ranch. There's a lot of different factors that come into that in terms of compensation and various elements. We're going to be exploring that a little bit. Also, things to consider when you're considering moving your ranching operation to a geographically different area. And also another topic that we're getting into is DNA testing. I've talked about it before, but I think there's more applicability to our industry, and especially for those of us in the commercial side of things. We're going to be talking about that in upcoming shows, so be sure to tune in here on the Working Ranch Radio Show. Well, if you'd like to get a hold of me about something you heard here today, a question you might might have on this show or previous shows, or an idea for a topic, please feel free to send me an email at justin.workingranch@gmail.com, or you can send me a text at 307-363-COWS. The Working Ranch Radio Show is a production of Working Ranch Magazine, branded #1 by America's Ranchers. Thanks for joining me. I'm your host, Justin Mills, and until next time, keep your chin down and your mind in the middle. So long.